All right. I think where we finished up last week, more or less, was finishing up the end of part of the video from Dr. Reeves on fundamentalism. So are there any questions lingering from the discussion of fundamentals? So you are all ready for the pop quiz right now? I'm going to throw a little bit out there. Name one of the fundamentals that was on Ryan Reeves' list. And if you have notes, you're cheating. So if you have notes, you can consult them because you were taking them. Anybody remember any of the fundamentals that were listed there? They weren't, remember, it wasn't a fully inclusive list, but the list that he provided.
Inerrancy of the Bible.
Inerrancy of the Bible.
Truth of miracles.
Yep.
Substitutionary atonement.
Right.
Virgin birth. And the resurrection of Christ.
Right. So that obviously either incredible memory, which I would believe, or that's coming from notes.
No, yeah, it did. Sorry.
Yeah. And remember that list. And remember that list is not intended to be everything, but intended to be some of the major things. And then we talked about some of the details of that as we moved through. So if I say the word evangelical, what pops into your head?
Billy Graham.
Okay.
I know he's an evangelist, but evangelical meaning more preaching to those outside of the church in hopes of them coming to the church.
Okay. What else?
Cats.
Cats.
The musical Cats, there's a line in one of the songs about evangelical.
Oh, Kathy, who would remember that? Jeez Louise. That was one of the few I kind of fell asleep in. That was
actually there. That's one of the adjectives of Cats in the opening number. So yeah, we're wired that way. I'm sorry.
I think Kathy did a good job describing it.
You know, the naming of cats is a difficult matter. All right. So yeah, I think, you know, I immediately also associate some of the same things, evangelical, and evangelism and evangelical obviously come from the same, you know, similar roots and connect to the same things. And really this goes back to, we spent a good amount of time talking about it, the first and second Great Awakenings or evangelical movements, where there was more of an emphasis on evangelism and open air preaching to those who were not in the church or that type of thing. So that carries through the entire 19th century and into the 20th century. If I use the word evangelical today, what pops into your head?
Bible pushers.
Yeah,
Fundamentalists.
I think, and Mickey, you sort of hit it on the head. It has a connection to fundamentalism, and or today the two things get connected. Evangelicals are fundamentalists. Fundamentalists are evangelicals. They are not the same thing, but in a Venn diagram, particularly today, there would be a lot of overlap between two of the circles, but they're not perfect circles that lay over each other. These are not, you know, one-on-one correspondence things. I think you'll see that as we go through the Ryan Reeves video here. We're gonna look at the video on evangelicalism, the rise of evangelicalism, and you'll see the connections to what we talked about last week with fundamentalism, but you'll also see what's different and not the same. Let me get where I'm sharing the screen. I'm actually click share. That's why that was different than what I thought. Now makes sense. And let me make sure I am sharing sound. So let me know when you guys, just make sure when this starts that you guys can hear it. Y'all hear that?
Yes. In this lecture, we're looking at the rise of evangelicalism. And this lecture title, frankly, has a bit of a tongue-in-cheek meaning. Of course, up until this point, we've looked at the context of the Great Awakenings, the holiness movements, and revival and millenary movements, and all types of different things that really provide the shape and the context of the origins of evangelicalism. In fact, historically, if we were to say, when does evangelicalism begin? We wouldn't say in the 20th century, we would say back in the 1700s. But very often today, what we have is a bit of a false memory or an amnesia to a lot of this backstory. It's not uncommon today to hear people talk about evangelicals in the 20th century. Those who do very often only go back to the fundamentalist movement in the late 1800s. Unfortunately, what that does is it pitches evangelicalism as simply a reaction to the perils of modernism, as if evangelicalism is merely an antithetical movement to what's going on in culture. And perhaps that's what people want to believe or want to see. They want to marginalize evangelicals as merely the new group that changed Christianity and that altered all types of different things. Well, as we've seen in a number of lectures up until this point, evangelicalism in the New World does change things. It does bring new ideas to bear and a new culture to bear. But what we're not dealing with is an entirely new wave of evangelicalism in the 20th century. Rather, what we have is the rise of evangelicalism within the consciousness of the wider cultural, political, and scientific world around us. We see evangelicalism becoming more powerful, more part of established political and cultural networks, often at times designed to overthrow or challenge some of the world around it. But what we're going to say in this lecture is that to pin everything onto one source, one story, or to one origin point within the history of evangelicalism as a whole is to miss the story. The fact of the matter is, evangelicalism is wildly complex, and since it goes back to the 1700s, of course, there's a lot of twists and turns in the story. But what we're talking about now is the rise of 20th century evangelicalism and the way that evangelicals engage, challenge, and take issue with a number of the things in the world around us. And you might say that there are three defining characteristics of what evangelicals go through in the 20th century. Three defining questions or issues that we're going to see recur again and again and again in the context of the modern world. And the first is evangelicals have to work very hard in the 20th century at defining to what extent are they part of this fundamentalist reaction against the modern world, and to what extent are they not. Of course, in our lecture on fundamentalism, we did talk a lot about the variety of different reactions and rejections of certain very hostile modernistic tendencies over against the faith. So not everything that is evangelical is fundamentalist. But you might say that the 20th century was the shaking out of what that definition is. There were already holiness movements. There were already obviously strong theological commitments within Protestantism that go all the way back to the Reformation. And while some become progressive and update and change their theological or their cultural assumptions on a variety of different points, to equate evangelicalism with fundamentalism is a bit of a misstep, historically speaking. But then again, in the 20th century, evangelicals will work very hard to determine where they fit in to the story of the wider fundamentalist movement. The second question is, where do evangelicals fit culturally and politically with the world around them? In the context of America, of course, it's the question of, should Christians get involved in politics? Should Christians get involved in academia, in the halls of power in this world? Now, what we need to say right now, of course, is everyone throughout American history has always leveraged their ethical, their moral, their religious stance when it comes to their politics. In some ways, this is the curse of America, you might say, though I don't mean that to be too negative. But rather, it's the problem that we have, which is America, for all of its separation of church and state, very often cannot tell where the theological or the philosophical positions of people begin and where their political involvement ends. This means that one group, despite their commitments, ethically, theologically, whatever, are yelling at some other group because they're, quote, bringing their faith into politics. Well, that's the American story, I'm afraid. Everyone does this. The problem is to what extent and in what way. And evangelicals in the 20th century will not be immune to that. In fact, they'll be very much part and parcel to that unfolding story. And thirdly, lastly, what are the theological limits within evangelicalism? Now, of course, evangelicalism is shaped predominantly by a commitment to Christ and a commitment to revivals and to holy living. The problem, though, of course, is that is not necessarily a creedal confessional boundary as to what defines them theologically. And you really see precursors of this in the 19th century, but evangelicals, particularly in the 20th century, will fight a number of wars internally, metaphorical wars, of course, as to what it is to be evangelical. Is it okay to embrace, for example, open theism? Or is it okay to embrace certain theological or cultural positions that are not typical for other evangelicals? And you see at times movements to spit out some group and let them go be their own thing and to no longer call them evangelical. Well, okay, let's go through the history of the development of evangelicalism in the 20th century.
Let's stop here. The three questions were what?
Is evangelical, oh my gosh, now I can't even say it.
Is evangelicalism fundamentalist?
Thank you. I couldn't get the word out.
So is the answer to that question yes or no?
But
Why?
kind of also, again, in response to the kind of modernization type of a thing. Away from that modernization.
And again, to me, the simplest way, it may not be the most correct way to answer this, but the simplest way to answer this is that there's tremendous overlap between people who would be comfortable having both labels attached to them. There are a number of evangelicals that would actually wear the label that they're a fundamentalist with pride. So while they're not the same thing, again, they overlap in such a way that you may begin to think they are the same thing. And it is true that most of the modern evangelical movement, the 20th century that he's going to cover here, is just a continuation and an outflow of some of the things that go back to the Great Awakenings, but also from the fundamentalist movements of the late 19th century. For example, in our denomination, just in Southern Baptists, there are a large number of congregations that are fundamentalist or lean fundamentalist in their views. We talked about that to some degree. We'll talk about it some more. I know it's in some of the other stuff we're going to look at. And they would certainly also consider themselves to be evangelical in the sense of emphasizing evangelism. So that's where the overlap happens there. It talks about evangelicals in culture. What's the relationship of being evangelical and the relationship to culture? What was he talking about there? Cool, Mickey?
I think several things. I think culture, you have a religious culture too. For instance, Darby, in reference to the second coming, you also have situations where you, in your culture, have a tendency to be a little more tolerant at times of things that traditionally has not been acceptable. I think then, of course, the evangelicals, in my view, are very solid fundamentalists, the way I see them. And they pursue what I consider fundamental thinking in reference to marriage, in reference to treating your fellow human being, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes the only thing I'm concerned about some of the fundamentalists and evangelicals is that they have a tendency to think a little bit they're superior. I worry about that simply because I see some of our friends thinking in terms that the sinners are, especially on the political field, are wrong, and they demean them and that sort of thing. So that concerns me. It's not a lot, but it seems like that's a sort of a slight trend the way I see it.
I think the term, if you had talked about evangelicals, if you go back in time, let's say to just the 60s or 70s, I'm trying to pick a good arbitrary date, point in time. If you went back in time to, let's say, the 60s or the 70s, I think you would see evangelicals more engaged in larger social questions. For example, one of the images that he showed there was Billy Graham and Martin Luther King. Questions about race relations and things like the validity of maybe certain wars or certain conflicts, cultural things, social things, and to a degree political things, but more focused on the social side of things, if that makes any sense. Economic equality, segregation, those types of things. But I do think that in the last 20 to 25 years, when you use the term evangelical outside of talking about that in the church, more people associate that now with a political aspect. I don't know if I'm just curious, would you guys agree with that it has more of a political flavor to it now than it used to? And it's not that it didn't have a connection to culture before, it just now seems to rise more in politics and not just in social questions.
I think so.
It's hard to go through an election cycle where you don't hear talking heads and pundits talking about the evangelical vote, as an example. Evangelicals are not a political party, but yet they're talked about as if if there's a definite political philosophy. And I don't even think I think there's differences inside of those who would readily take the title of evangelical about what they believe politically, or even how much they believe politics should be used to implement their views on theology. I guess that's the other thing that's there. Back to your point, maybe to a degree, Mickey, is the role of evangelicals in politics, not just what they, in terms of wanting to use political means to accomplish goals. So there is a connection, obviously, between theology and culture. We've talked about that all the way through. And the last thing is, sort of what I just hinted at, it's the worldview and politics part. So how much is your view of the world, how much is your theology informing your view of the world and politics? And the answer is all of us are informed that way. It's just a question of how much it plays itself out.
Well, that wasn't the third question, though. World and politics came in under the
Right.
adding culture.
It's the actual third question was, what are the boundaries?
And I think that's why the first question is hard, because there are a few points that aren't, so that there's an equal sign between them.
What do you mean?
Well, hopefully we wouldn't have two names basically for exactly the same thing. So there's a little bit of difference between. That there's, I mean, he even said it. I don't remember what he said right after it, but they're not. When he was talking about they're not exactly the same thing.
What I'm reading right now is on Trotsky, 1917, and it's fascinating how much I could go along with Trotsky in reference to keep in mind that was World War I, and they wanted to stop the war. The war was just a horrendously horrible thing. And there was a whole bunch of social problems at that point in time. Corruption in the Democratic Republic was rampant like it is today. And I could see a lot of what I could easily go over and accept. But by the same token, there's a limit, there's a boundary as to how much I can accept from Trotsky in reference to the economic system. I think there's even capitalism, in my opinion, has got some, on the whole, Christianity and capitalism has pulled the entire world out of poverty, in my view. But there are points and times when the multi-billionaires are beginning to assert their rules and power. That disturbs me, and that also disturbs me in the sense that their morality is not as keen as I would like to see it. So I think there are boundaries, and I think there are boundaries. Let me go stay there.
Okay, yeah, I agree. And figuring out where those boundaries are and what is the role, this is, we touched on this, but we sort of skirted around it when we talked a little bit about the difference between the evolution of more of the Northern Baptists versus Southern Baptists, where a lot more of the Northern Baptists became involved in social causes and social justice issues. Is that, what is the role of me doing the things that I'm called to do in Scripture, taking care of my neighbor directly one-on-one versus activating a political system to do that for me, even if that's the right thing to do? Where's the boundary in that? And I think that's where a lot of the tension, that's the word I'll use to describe the tension exists between evangelicals in the 21st century, politics, the church, and theology. I'll just leave it at that too. Gonna roll us forward here.
To the history of the development of evangelicalism in the 20th century. The backdrop, of course, is the revivalism, and the modern world after Darwin. We saw, of course, in our lecture on fundamentalism, that there were a number of folks who were beginning to really react negatively to the desire by some, both in the church and from outside the church, to challenge traditional doctrines. So, for example, the modernist belief that there can be no such thing as a miracle. Well, of course, the church, not just evangelicals, but the church has always said that miracles are possible. God is the creator and he can do as he wishes. And in fact, the New Testament and the Old Testament are full of accounts of God intervening in a miraculous way. Things like this become really the defining separation between progressives and those who are part of the revival movement. But what happens in the early 1900s is a number of folks begin to organize themselves, you might say, around this fight, this struggle against the world that is progressive. So in 1919, there is founded the World Christian Fundamentals Association. It's a bit of a long name, a bit of a hard name sometimes to say, if you say it too fast. But this group is in particular where we get the real core ethos of what the fundamentalist movement is, at least as we know it today. And this was started by William Bell Riley, a man who very much came out of the holiness tradition of the 1800s and who was very much concerned about modernism. And actually, it's this group in 1919, again, that gives us the name fundamentalist in that very crystallized sense. There was a man in 1920, just a year after, named Curtis Laws, who was a Baptist man and a journalist. And he wrote about this new group who was centered around this fight with the modern world, with the progressives. And he says, how are we going to describe them? How are we going to label this group? And he tries on a few names, and he says that they're all wanting. That when you try to encapsulate really what the group here in 1919 is about, there's no single doctrine, but rather there is a core conviction to fight the fight. And so he says, how about we call them fundamentalists? And of course, the history of that word has just spread like wildfire. Today, we can talk about all kinds of folks as being fundamentalist. And it's really a negative word now, but in the context of 1919, 1920, it was not. It was rather a historical categorization as to what we're going to call the group within the Protestant evangelical world who were fighting against modernism or some of the progressive tendencies there. Now, here's an important thing. Despite the fact that fundamentalists here in the early 1900s have a great deal of power, they were not embraced by everybody. In some ways, their fight and their relationship to the wider Protestant world mimics some of the fights about revivals that we saw in the Great Awakening movements. There were some, actually not a few people, who felt that fundamentalists were taking hostage the evangelical and the Protestant witness. So, for example, Harry Emerson Fosdick, very, very influential evangelical in the 20th century, actually preached a sermon just in this same window of time, entitled, "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" And of course, he says, Lord, I hope not. That's really his position. And he cites that he feels that the fundamentalist movement is anti-intellectual, anti-tradition, and anti-modern, at least in the sense of being anti-anything that is current. You might say that he's saying that fundamentalists have thrown the baby out with the bath. In their effort to fight against progressives, they're now fighting against everyone who happens to be living in the 20th century. So right there you see a bit of a split. There is the fundamentalist movement now organizing itself and really galvanizing some of its interests. And you see intellectual, seminary-trained, theologically trained, ordained pastors saying, well, hold on, we're not anti-intellectual, and we're not just simply defined by what we're not. And there is already a great deal of concern about the relationship between fundamentalists and the identification of the wider world that this is all Christianity is about. One of the more important things, though, about this fundamentalist group, the World Christian Fundamentals Association, is it actually marks one of the earliest times, at least, not the earliest, but one of the earliest times in which evangelicals get involved with politics and with creating policies that they hoped would stem the tide of the modernist movement. Now, this is important. It is not the moral majority. It is not the 1980s. It's not Jerry Falwell who invents the idea that evangelicals should be involved with policies, politics, or the world around us. Again, all types of different worldviews do this, and they continue to do so in the 21st century. But in terms of evangelical history, it's actually right here in the context of the early 1900s where you begin to see this fundamentalist group begin to sort of leverage its weight in the political arena in order to get legislation passed that they hope, again, will hold off the progressives. And in fact, it's this group that provides the context for the Scopes monkey trial. There was a man who was very instrumental and, in fact, a leader in this group named John W. Butler. Butler was a politician. He actually ran for president.
I have a dilemma here because he actually goes on here for an extreme amount of time on the Scopes trial, which is fascinating and it is important because he's bringing it up for a particular reason. So, but I don't want to spend 15 to 20 minutes of video watching on something that is sort of tangential to what we're doing here. So my question is, if I say Scopes monkey trial, that's what it's commonly referred to as, what do you know about that?
I want to be honest, I know nothing.
Okay.
Is it about whether or not to teach evolution in schools?
Correct. Well, yes. Although it's about more than that, which is sort of his point for bringing it up in this video, is it because it's representative of other things. But yes, it was ostensibly a trial in Tennessee where a law had been passed which said it was not legal to teach evolution, and John Scopes, who was actually a physical ed teacher who's occasionally taught in other classes in the school, was the test case for this. We'll go ahead and watch part of it. I may skip over part of it. I don't want to get bogged down in it, but it's important because it's representative of this connection between fundamentalism and politics, how this was playing out in the early 20th century, particularly this is right after the end of World War I.
President at one point. Obviously, it failed, or you would remember his name. But Butler was a man who was very much concerned about where the world was going. And so he got involved in the state of Tennessee with the passing of legislation that would take his name. It's called the Butler Act. And the Butler Act in Tennessee made it illegal, in a misdemeanor sense, to teach evolution in public schools. And this more or less is the first political attempt to hold off Darwinianism. And it does give rise to the Scopes monkey trial, which so many of us are aware of. Now here's the problem. Most of what we know about the Scopes monkey trial at the popular level, at the more or less urban legend level, is entirely made up. It's simply not the case historically. The problem here, of course, is there is a very important book, Inherit the Wind, that became an Academy Award-winning movie and then a play. And it's a more or less account or a retelling of the story. The problem, though, is it functions very much like the Scarlet Letter does for the history of Puritanism. It's completely made up in the sense of it puts in play ideas and vocabularies and concepts that were not there in the original. In fact, Inherit the Wind, the book, is not written about Christianity and modernism. Rather, it's a tale of what? An oppressive regime that is telling people what they can and cannot believe. Actually, Inherit the Wind and the movie that came out of it, again, is not about Christianity, it's actually about Marxism. The Hollywood adaptation of it was inspired because of the McCarthy hearings and the pretty zealous, almost rabid commitment to stop anyone from being quote-unquote communist or Marxist in the context of the states. So Inherit the Wind is not an historical account. And it's a good movie. It's actually, again, an Academy Award-winning movie, but it's not the actual story that happened. Well, what happened then at the Scopes monkey trial? Well, of course, there is an element of Darwinianism and evangelicalism that's at play here.
So remember, part of the reason for the rise of fundamentalism, evangelicalism, is in response to modernism in the late 19th century, and that is very much represented by Darwin, evolution. So where this connects, how this connects is the fact that fundamentalism was a response to the rise of modernism. Everybody, that makes sense to everybody? That's in a broad philosophical sense. Now here's a practical sense. Darwin teaches what, or advocates for what in The Origin of the Species? Evolution. So the question is, when kids are being taught in school for the origin of man and other things, what are they going to be taught? Are they going to be taught a biblical creation story? What is coming to be held by more and more as quote unquote the scientific understanding, which is what Darwinism and evolution is seeking to be at this point, is not quite as fully permeated as it is today. And so this comes to a head in the Scopes trial in Tennessee.
Butler Act was a real thing, and John Butler actually believed that it would work. He was, again, part of the fundamentalist movement. The rest of the story, though, is where we tend to go off the rails. The fact is that the Scopes monkey trial was a publicity stunt. What happened was when the legislation was passed, the ACLU doesn't see it so much as a problem of religion. Rather, they are concerned about the problem of the First Amendment and free speech. They are concerned that limiting what people are allowed to say is fundamentally against the First Amendment of the United States. They actually have a point here on some level. But again, the ACLU is not actually going after this because it's a religious issue. In fact, when it does immediately become one, they are actually a bit concerned that they don't pull the plug. The ACLU actually, when the Butler Act was passed, issued a statement that they were looking for anyone who was willing to take this to court, that they would fund it, that they would back it. Now, of course, no one really wanted to do this. No one wanted to be that out in the open about it. They didn't want to be shunned in certain communities. However, in the city of Dayton, Tennessee, there was a man by the name of George Rapelier. And George was a church-going man. He actually was a Christian, but he was a believer in evolution. He believed that it was compatible with his Christian faith. He was an engineer, though, and he had an eye towards PR, let's say. And George writes to the ACLU and says, well, I'm willing to try to stoke something up here in Dayton. His intentions were that this trial would bring a lot of attention to the city of Dayton, Tennessee, and that maybe people would bring business there, this type of thing. They then enlist Scopes himself. Now, the story that's usually told is that Scopes was a principled biology teacher there in the public schools, that he openly taught evolution, and that he was rung up, arrested, and then put on trial for this. Actually, Scopes was in on it. George approaches him and he says, hey, how about we collaborate and come up with a show trial to put this issue on the map? The problem, though, is Scopes isn't actually the biology teacher in the local school. He's the football coach. Straight up, he's the football coach. He substitute taught the course on biology whenever he needed to. He had a minor in geology. He did not actually study biology in his collegiate days. What's interesting is when asked, Scopes says, well, actually, I don't know if I taught evolution to anybody. And actually later a reporter finds out that when it came to the chapter from this textbook that discussed evolution, that Scopes actually skipped the chapter and moved on. Meaning, Scopes isn't the dyed-in-the-wool evolutionist that we think he is. Rather, he's just the man who said, sure, I'll do it. I'll have my name put out there as the man who taught evolution. The other thing is that a number of Scopes students were asked if they were taught evolution. It was an open secret actually there, and we know it now in the records, but the students were coached as to what to say. They were coached to talk about evolution, that Scopes had taught this in the classroom. So already, not the obvious case of religion on trial, this type of thing. The next piece is the man who in Inherit the Wind is seen as the hero, Clarence Darrow, was actually himself a pretty pungent atheist, believe it or not, or at the very least an agnostic. But here's the thing, Darrow was in on it too. And the reason Darrow is selected is because he was very, very popular. Darrow was more or less the Johnny Cochran of his generation. Those of you who are, of course, aware of the O.J. Simpson trial will remember that Johnny Cochran was the profound defense attorney who became very famous for his defense of O.J. Well, Clarence Darrow had been part of himself a very showcase murder trial there in the early 1900s. In fact, it was called the trial of the century in its day. So Darrow is famous, and they know that if they use him, that all the eyes will be drawn to it. Okay, so what happened? Well, the short answer is, it's a result of a bit of a media propaganda war that made the Scopes trial what we know it to be today. There's a very famous man, an essayist, H.L. Mencken, very, very popular, very, very scathing, very, very caustic, but a very, very influential writer around this day. H.L. Mencken actually takes the Scopes monkey trial on, and he is just blistering and scathing about these backward bumpkin religious types who are trying to end what he believes established science. Other news reporters, of course, pick up the same tone, and what was intended by the ACLU to be a free speech grandstanding moment suddenly becomes, in the minds of those present, at least in terms of the reporters, and ever since, a trial of Christianity versus science. Darrow does a very interesting thing. He actually asked, at the very end actually, for the verdict to come back, and he quietly says that his request would be that the verdict would be guilty, that Scopes would pay the fine, in order that, he said, the case could then be remanded up to the Supreme Court of Tennessee. And lo and behold, that is exactly what happened. A guilty verdict came back. Scopes was guilty and fined $100, which is a modest amount of money in this day and age. And, believe it or not, Darrow paid the fine himself. Scopes lost nothing in this endeavor. Actually, later, Scopes is awarded a scholarship to go finish his studies in geology. He goes on to work in the oil industry, and he converts to Roman Catholicism. But the die is cast. The Scopes monkey trial really put on the stage, even if it's not historically accurate or not, but it put into the bloodstream this concern, this fear, that what is going on in the world right now is that the fundamentalists are waging a war that will end up being a Pyrrhic victory. Of course, a Pyrrhic victory is one where you win, but you've lost so much in the context of the winning of your war that you might as well have lost yourself. And so, ever since, the Scopes monkey trial has been Christianity versus science. It's always talked about this way in text.
Actually, I'm not sure why he doesn't mention this, because this is also important. Does anybody know who that man is on the screen right there? You'd have to be an American political junkie, I think, to probably know.
He was running for president, so wasn't he? I can think of his. Give me a few seconds, I'll come up with his name. But gosh, William Jennings Bryan.
That's William Jennings Bryan, who was a candidate. He was a Democratic candidate for the presidency in the late 19th century. He's probably best known in American history for 1896 Democratic Convention, his
Cross of Gold.
The Cross of Gold speech. Yeah. And which was, at that time, the debate was raging over whether the US currency should be backed by a gold standard or a silver standard. And it was particularly an issue of the Democratic Party, who represented more rural interests, that the gold standard and so-called hard money was an impediment to them. In fact, a lot of the Wizard of Oz has a lot of this stuff in it. There's a reason that it's the yellow brick road. It's a gold road in Frank Baum's thing. It's more of an allegory. But William Jennings Bryan, this is actually this is 1920-ish. He was basically retired, had been an attorney, had been a politician, had ran for president at least twice, including in 1896 when he lost. But he actually is brought in to be the prosecutor in this trial in Tennessee. So when Reeves is talking here about how this was basically, if we had court TV, this would have been a made-for-TV trial. On the defense side, you have Darrow brought in because of his name. On the prosecution side, the little town there in Tennessee brings in sort of a free agent heavy hitter in the form of William Jennings Bryan to represent the interests of the state, so to speak. So I don't know why he doesn't mention that, because it just further makes the point of how this was about what it was about, but it wasn't about what it was about.
Books, doesn't matter the history, this is the legacy of this moment. Well, believe it or not, that and a number of other things shapes and forms the context of evangelicalism in the 20th century. But here's the thing, it's not just about science. There are other factors that evangelicals get involved with that flow out of the early 20th century, and these are almost always forgotten, and we really need to focus on them now. The fact of the matter is that evangelicals at times, particularly in the Deep South, often paired up their rhetoric of concern that the world is going to hell in a handbasket with their advocacy of the Jim Crow laws and the constant application and the reinforcement of segregation. The fact of the matter is the problem of evangelicals in the early half of the 20th century, and frankly on after, is that there was initially a very hostile anti-civil rights movement amongst some, not all, but principally amongst fundamentalist groups. You might say that the problems of modernity had so caused some fundamentalists and fundamentalist camps to oppose any change to anything, that when it came to things that would have been easily embraced by evangelicals in a previous century, at least by and large, certainly not by everybody, suddenly you see people decrying the end of segregation, and in particular when the Jim Crow laws are overturned, you see lots of problems here and lots of complaints. Well, again, just to kind of give you the tone of this, as the fundamentalist movement is crashing its boat at times on the rocks of the modern world, you have a number of people that arise within the evangelical movement that seek a different path. They no longer like the anti-intellectualism and the political muscle of some of these groups, and so what they seek is to change it. And that is very important, because what happens in the early 40s and 50s and on into the 60s is you have arise the movement of Neo-Evangelicalism. And these are intellectual leaders who want to see an end to the fundamentalist takeover and stronghold, or at least the way the fundamentalists seem to always get the headlines. Perhaps one of the most important, if not the most important man that really shaped Neo-Evangelicalism was Harold John Ochengate. Ochengate lived from 1905 to 1985. He was pastor of a historic church, the Park Street Church in downtown Boston. And Ochengate and others really began to have problems with some of the fundamentalist fights. Another was Carl F.H. Henry out in Chicago. And both of these men in particular, but Ochengate principally, began to stress that they want to become neo-evangelicals, And what they mean by that is they're still evangelicals, but the way that the fundamentalists have taken over things, as well as the heritage of the revivalist movement and some of the holiness movements, that was anti-traditional, anti-creed, anti-confession, these types of things. What Ochengate and others say is we need an intellectually credible, thoughtful, reflective evangelicalism that both will not embrace the modern revisionist, you might say more cynical approach to religion, but which would be orthodox, conservative, and yet intellectually credible. And there's a number of things that sort of fan out, in particular with Ochengate and others, and we can highlight just a few here. In 1947, for example, there is the founding of Fuller Seminary out in California. And this was started by Ochengate and others, and the goal here was to create, lo and behold, an intellectually credible, authentic, theologically rigorous seminary. Now, it doesn't hold for long. There is a great fight in the 1960s at Fuller on the subject of inerrancy. And we can't go into that story in great detail, but it was enormously complex and very challenging, frankly, as to the future of these types of endeavors. But there were others. There was formed, for example, the National Association of Evangelicals, in large part due to Ochengate and others. And again, this is neo-evangelical. It's seeking an intellectually credible expression of what it means to be evangelical, a more historic Protestant expression of evangelicalism, we might say. Flowing out of that, of course, Ochengate was very, very connected with a couple of influential evangelicals who felt similarly at times, namely Billy Graham and Mr. Pugh himself, the man who was part of the Sun Oil Company and a man who had enormous wealth, and he wanted to help fund and influence the shape of this new intellectually credible evangelicalism. So in 1956, Billy Graham was instrumental in bringing together the formation of Christianity Today, a magazine, of course, that's still in print. And the goal of it was to stand toe-to-toe with some of the more progressive Protestant magazines out there that were teaching things that were not part and parcel of the historic Protestant faith. Christianity Today actually was founded to be an answer, not a hostile one, but a winsome, reflective, intellectually credible one to the world around it. In 1969, those same guys, Ochengate, Billy Graham, and Pugh, teamed up again to form a seminary. They brought together two institutions, Gordon Divinity School and Conwell School for Ministry, the first in Boston, the second in Philadelphia, to create Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, this time one on the East Coast, planted right there in Boston with all of those wonderful top-level universities. But again, one that would be intellectually credible, yet still evangelical and thoughtful. One that would not leave aside the roots, but would not embrace a fundamentalist, anti-modern stance. So by the time you get to the 1960s, you have successes and failures and a number of issues that are on the rise as to how evangelicals are going to get on in the modern world. And there's really, I would say, four unanswered or perennial questions that come up after the evolution of these divisions. The first, of course, is evangelicalism of the 20th century is going to recommit itself to what it means to do revivals, what it means to do evangelism. And we've already signaled one name right there, Billy Graham. No other person has spoken to more people in an evangelistic, conversionistic gospel way than Billy Graham has here in the 20th century and now on into the 21st century. The Billy Graham Association, of course, is enormously influential in not allowing evangelicals to forget its roots from a century or more before, which is that evangelicals are about revival, they're about conversion, and they're about sharing Christ. There are others, Campus Crusade, InterVarsity, a number of different groups that come out of the 20th century, some within the church, some parachurch, that say that they are there to recall and to recover what it means to be revivalistic whenever we say that we are evangelical. Another question, another issue that keeps coming up is an ongoing reflection within evangelicals as to how we're going to recover an intellectually robust, thoughtful, and engaged position within the modern world. And this is really Ochengate and Carl F.H. Henry's vision, that evangelicals would be detached from the anti-intellectualism of the fundamentalist movement. And we can think of Francis Schaeffer and the formation of L'Abri and a lot of his discussions of worldview and ways to offer critique without being critical. And of course, the magazine Christianity Today, which we've already noted. There really is a push, particularly from 1950 until now, for evangelicals to get back into the life of the mind, not as an exclusion of revivalism or conversionism or piety, but rather, if the evangelical world is going to have any answer for the modern world, they have to be intellectually credible. Third, to what extent do evangelicals want to keep going back to the issue of politics and to legislation in order to find its way forward in terms of the cultural fights around them? And frankly, it's still going on down to the modern world. If you are one of these people who believes that evangelicals now are too often engaged in politics, too often engaged in legislation, well, it's actually, again, something that has been around for quite some time. And evangelicals are not always happy about this. For every movement that was anti-science, for every movement that has sought change through politics or through an election, there have been just about as many who have said, I'm not sure if this is the way forward. We can't enforce it, we can't offer legislation, and even if we win, sometimes we lose. And that really is the legacy of the Scopes trial. Lastly, bridges and boundaries, as I say. How is evangelicalism going to go forward in the mid to late 20th century and down until today with determining how far is too far? On what issues will they compromise in order to collaborate? And you can think of all kinds of different things, of course, theologically. Will evangelical groups work together even if they share different views on baptism, the end times, these kinds of things? But also, very importantly, evangelicals have had to ask a lot of hard questions in the latter half of the 20th century as to will they engage with Catholics? Will they be so-called co-belligerents in the fight to end things like abortion and some of the cultural fights that are out there? That answer is honestly left unanswered. There is no single answer, and there probably never will be. But this is one of the issues. If evangelicals feel at times that they're losing power, losing influence, losing a voice, and they need help, how far will they reach to different entities, different denominations, different traditions, the Catholics in this sense, to affect some of the change that they wish to see in their culture? Now, lastly, what happens to the fundamentalists? We just told the long, pretty sweeping story of the Neo-Evangelicals. Where do the fundamentalists go? Well, the answer is they go a number of different directions. We've already signaled that one of the underexplored and underappreciated realities of the early 20th century is the extent to which fundamentalists in particular were very, very tied up with the anti-desegregation, the mingling of races, particularly in the Deep South. Now, it's not just in the Deep South, that's a myth. There's just as much of this problem felt at times in the North and out West. But the Deep South was known more for being pretty vitriolic on the subject. You might say that up until Roe v. Wade, the fact is that certain fundamentalists were radically opposed to any mingling of races and to any of the destabilizing effects that came about as a result of the civil rights movement. And in fact, in many ways, Roe v. Wade and the ensuing fights over abortion are much of the reason why we don't remember this part of the story. It feels that evangelicals have always been against abortion. Well, that's only from the 1970s on. There is a dark past, there's a problematic past, frankly, of the problems of fundamentalists and the issue of race in America. The question, of course, is why? Well, the answer is, for some, it was just simply part of their racist outlook. It was just simply a position they held. But in a wider sense, this signals some of the problem that Ochengate and others felt when they looked at the fundamentalist movement, is that they are so reactionary against any change, and that they are so anti-intellectual that they forget their own heritage, and they forget that evangelicals and Protestants have not always been the people who are about oppression and suppression. That is part of the history, yes, but when all you are, Ochengate might say, is defined by what you're not, if you're simply defined by not being this, or resisting change at all costs, if there is no intellectually robust undergirding of who you are, well then you're simply going to be opposed to every change whatsoever. And so that long history of desegregation, civil rights, and some of the fundamentalist problems with it really comes out of this context of the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So in the end, evangelicals in the 20th century inherited a number of problems and a number of fights. There were a number of questions that were left unanswered or that are still on the table even to this day. But in general, the condensing of what it means to be fundamentalist and the ensuing break-off of neo-evangelicals and the attempt to have an intellectually robust Christian evangelical witness is perhaps the most defining struggle in the entirety of the 20th century.
That was a lot. Comments or thoughts about that?
I think it was a great presentation, and it seems like that I'm always talking about the pendulum going back and forth. I think that pendulum is headed back to science. What is amazing to me is the extreme left. Keep in mind, I consider everybody, the Republicans, Democrats, as leftists in the sense the old classical concept of left. But nevertheless, the reality is that pendulum is swinging back. You have more and more biology professors and theologians are talking about the cell. The cell is so extremely complicated that Darwin's concepts need to be re-examined. You also have the left claiming that they're for science, but the reality is that they're now claiming that men can have babies. And the reality is you're having a lesbian claim that she's switching over to a male type agenda and claiming that she can still have a baby and she's still a male concept. So there's a lot of problems, but I believe in science. And I think the very fact that Tennessee was trying to force evolution off the table, I think was a terrible mistake, because I think you need to present all the facts. And I think that pendulum is swinging slowly back to reality and what I call reality in true science, and more of a democratic, get everything on the table, let's look at it, and whatever comes up that is scientifically can be proven, I'm for it. That's my thinking.
If the truth is truth, it will stand.
You got it.
And I think the interesting thing to me that was, and just, full disclosure here, he's not hiding anything because you were looking directly at the institution that he talked about, Gordon Conwell, is where this gentleman teaches. So he's giving some of the background of how that came to be in the Neo-Evangelical movement. So that tells you where he comes from theologically as well. But, he talked about there having, particularly the Neo-Evangelicals, were not moving away from science or from reason, or basically it was, if we're going to argue these positions, we need to be able to fully articulate them.
Correct.
And to have an intellectual basis for them. And so you do see a number of things that have been written, in the last 30 to 40 years, but particularly in the last 20 years, that are scientific defenses of, as you say, the complexity of the cell, of creation, the idea that there's how do you, the chicken and the egg problem is the way it's often described, because it's a problem, which had to have come first, because in many of these things, when you look at them from the standpoint of evolution, you have things that interact with each other, that the way they interact with each other, one could not have come before the other. They had to have been done in unison, or else they wouldn't work the way they do, because they don't stand independently alone. And, so there is more, if you will, intellectual rigor, I think, that's going in even to the defense of, attacks on what doesn't make sense about evolution, or in defending creationism, or on the other things that are there. I think you have seen a rise in the intellectual rigor that's going behind them. My memory of part of the reason I remember the William Jennings Bryan thing about the Scopes monkey trial is I remember one of my good friends growing up in high school, his name was Ross. Ross is wasn't exactly the biggest student of history, but he was in honors classes. And so in our 11th grade American history, we're going through, and so we're in the second semester, and we come to the Scopes monkey trial, and the teacher is lecturing on that. And he mentions William Jennings Bryan serving in that role of, sort of hired gun, brought in prosecutor. And of course, he remembered that name from 2 or 3 months ago in the course of study when we were talking about the elections of the late 19th century. And Ross's comment, I remember it today like it was yesterday, was, that guy's still alive? Because and that actually sort of was a thing in the 1820s, because Bryan, I was looking up when Billy Graham was born earlier. Now I need to look up when William Jennings Bryan was born, and it was he was older. You can see by the picture there. But I can guarantee you that in the study and in the presentation there, in the Scopes trial, Bryan was not bringing science to the defense of creation or the attack on evolution. It would be, this violates the Bible. It was very much referencing the Bible and referencing tradition. Whereas I think what you would see now, I guess literally 100 years later, it's hard to believe we're that far removed from it, is what you would see 100 years later now is more of, there's a lot more folks out there who are able to articulate a scientific criticism of evolution that provides support for the role of a creator. That's maybe a better way to say it, if that makes sense.
Very good.
There are a number of people, they're not just a couple, there are dozens, there are hundreds that are able to wade in with the science, not just with the one thing they're referring to when they're attacking evolution is not just pulling out the Bible. They do that, but they were able to actually attack it from the standpoint of science. And what's
Correct.
bad about the science? What are the holes in the science? And that's something that I think is more of that neo-evangelical aspect of things in the last 30 or 40 years, is the need for that.
Well, what's really amazing, as you point out in the past, some of your lectures, is that the major colleges were formed by the Christian community because they believed that there was a God and there was a creator, and you just need to investigate, how he did it, that sort of thing. So it's, as I pointed out, the pendulum, in my view, is swinging back like you're talking about.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Mickey, in the idea of the pendulum. It does tend to swing, back, and it swings back and forth.
Yes.
Any other comments, questions?
I can also remember a time when I was talking with a nurse who was a valued out Christian, and she was talking about abortion, and she was adamant about it. And there, for the longest, I was going along with her line of thinking. And I thought, then after a while, I began to realize my error. But I also began to realize the left was fulfilling that abortion concept through Margaret Sanger, and that you have 72% of the abortion clinics in the African-American community. And it's really bizarre politics. And you talk about boundaries, you talk about, to me, it's incredible. Sometimes your enemies are doing what the Christians in the 60s were thinking about, but have now realized that that was a total and absolute mistake. And so there again, the pendulum swings.
Yeah, without becoming incredibly political, one of the things that a good example is, the recently passed abortion law here in Texas is going to end up in court challenges.
Oh, absolutely.
There's no doubt about that. In fact, that in some ways, that was the point for passing the law. I understand the viewpoint of those that passed the law as well, in their position on abortion. And I don't want to go, down the path of, focusing too heavily on that, except to say that I understand, where that came from. And yes, they are certainly being advocates for the defense of life before birth, post-conception. But I hate to use because the very extreme position of that law relative to what has been the widely agreed, essentially compromise that came into being with Roe v. Wade is is intentional. It was intentionally that extreme because they want to, in some ways it shares, if this makes any sense, it shares parallels with the Scopes trial. What they really want to do is take it to some place just to have it litigated and to have it challenged. That's part of the purpose of it. And, that comes with an agenda. And, I guess where I come back to and Christian thought, and again, I have some sensitivity to this because I was adopted and born in 68, so before 73 in the state of Texas. So it was, do I exist today because of being before Roe versus Wade? I think that, it's something that does run through my head. But, I wish the church was engaged in pregnancy intervention for alternatives such as adoption, because I am adopted, as much as they are in terms of being anti-abortion. And I'm opposed to abortion as post-fact birth control. But are we offering a positive response, or are we offering just a negative response? And that's where I worry about how is that compatible with what we read in Scripture, I guess is my point. And I think it's hard. It's not easy, because if it were easy, we'd already have the answers to it.
There for a long time, I was anti-homosexual, anti-lesbian, what have you. But what I began to realize is that we've got about 5,000 or so need for adoption of children in Harris County area, from what I understand. I may be totally wrong on that, but there's a sizable number. And what I'm noticing is the lesbian community is coming in and adopting these kids. And I have a hard time throwing any stones at these people for doing something that Linda and I should probably be doing, or in the past. Right now, we're too old to play that game, but the boundaries concept.
Yeah. So, yeah, you've heard me say this before. One of them, I'll sort of close on this. One of the most profound moments I remember in my adult life was not realizing that the building that my office was in at that time had an abortion clinic inside of it, until I was walking from the garage that morning towards the building and had to walk through. This was in the early 90s. I had to walk through a protest. And some of the things that I saw, which were scripture verses on those placards, and some of the words and the actions that I saw come out of the mouths of those who were there protesting, while I agreed with their position on abortion, the way that they were doing that, I didn't see Jesus at all.
Correct.
And that was problematic for me. So, any other comments before I kill the recording? Thanks, guys. I'm killing the recording now.